All right, today we're going to dig into one of the most terrifying chapters in human history, the bubonic plague. But listen, this isn't just a story about death. It's really an explainer on how a global catastrophe tore down the entire old world and, pretty unexpectedly, laid the foundations for our own. Okay, let's dive right in.
I know, that sounds completely insane. But that's the big question we're going to explore. We're going to look at how an event that wiped out nearly half the population of Europe wasn't just an ending, but also a violent, world-shattering beginning.
So, where did this all even begin? Well, our story starts not with a big bang, but with a silent, invisible killer starting its long journey from the heart of Asia, and it was carried by the very thing that was supposed to represent wealth and connection: global trade.
This timeline really shows you the plague's relentless march. It probably began somewhere in Central Asia, hitching a ride on fleas that lived on rats, which, were all over the merchant caravans on the Silk Road. By 1347, it had reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, basically the doorstep of Europe. From there, merchants who were fleeing for their lives unknowingly carried it right into Sicily. And once it hit a major European port, it was game over. In just a few short years, it had literally consumed the known world.
And this brings us to a moment that is just truly horrifying. As the Mongol army was laying siege to the city of Kaffa, their own soldiers started dying from the plague. So in this move of just brutal, desperate strategy, they supposedly started launching their plague-infected corpses over the city walls with catapults. I mean, it was one of the first recorded acts of biological warfare, and it absolutely accelerated the plague's jump into Europe.
So the plague is here. Now, just try to imagine facing an enemy you can't see, you can't fight, and you have absolutely no idea what it is. That was the horrifying reality for every single person in the 14th century.
The gap between what they feared and what was true was just enormous. Back in the 1300s, people blamed everything they could think of. Miasma or bad air, maybe the alignment of the planets, or, of course, the wrath of God. They had zero concept of germs. Today, we know the culprit was a specific bacterium, Yersinia pestis, a microscopic killer carried by fleas.
And the effects of this thing were a complete nightmare. The most common form, the bubonic plague, caused these agonizing egg-sized swellings called buboes. But the mnemonic version, it was even worse. It was airborne. You could literally just breathe it in. Your lungs would liquefy, and you'd almost certainly be dead within a day. And the cures? Well, they were just as terrifying and totally useless, from those famous bird-like masks to, unbelievably, bathing in urine.
So with no real understanding and no effective cures, the very foundation of society started to crack, and then it just completely shattered. This was the abyss.
Just let that number sink in for a second. 50 million people. Some estimates put it as high as 60% of the entire population of Europe gone in less than 5 years. It is a scale of death that is almost impossible for us to truly comprehend today. And this quote from the writer Boccaccio really brings it from that staggering number down to the personal horror. See, it wasn't just about people dying. It was about the complete and total breakdown of human connection. The fear was so absolute that the most basic bonds we have, family, love, duty, they just dissolved.
So here's the crucial thing. This wasn't just a health crisis. It was a societal collapse. Parents were abandoning their own sick children. Priests, terrified of catching it, wouldn't even perform last rites. In all that chaos, you had these extreme movements pop up, like the flagellants. And in their terror, people looked for someone to blame. This led to horrific massacres of Jewish communities who were falsely accused of poisoning wells.
It is so hard to imagine, right? After all of that horror. But what if in the ashes of that old world, something new and completely unexpected was actually able to grow?
Because the plague's devastation didn't just cause an end, it actually forced a beginning. It was the violent trigger for the end of the Middle Ages and, believe it or not, the birth of the modern world.
This right here is maybe the plague's most profound legacy. Before, you had the feudal system. Lords had all the power, and peasants were basically their property, tied to the land. But then the plague kills so many workers that suddenly there's a massive labor shortage. And guess what? The survivors now had all the leverage. For the first time in centuries, regular people could demand higher wages, better conditions, and even their freedom. The entire power structure was flipped completely upside down.
We even see the beginnings of a more modern, scientific way of thinking in our own language. The plague gave us the concept and the word quarantine. It comes from the Italian for 40 days, the time ships had to wait offshore before anyone could come ashore.
It was a crude tool for sure, but it was the very beginning of public health. It was the idea that you could take organized secular action to fight a disease.
So yeah, the plague completely reshaped the world. But this isn't just some dusty history lesson. It has a direct and pretty surprising connection to our world right now, here in 2026.
That's right. The exact same bacterium that caused the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, it's still out there. It never actually went away. Now, before you start to panic, let's put this in context. The plague exists today kind of like a living fossil in certain rodent populations around the world, like in the American Southwest. The huge difference, the critical difference, is that today we have antibiotics that treat it easily. But the fact that it's still around is a pretty stark reminder of how our global networks, our trade routes, can become superhighways for disaster. That's a lesson that is just as relevant today as it was 700 years ago.
And that's really the final kind of provocative thought to leave you with. The Black Death was a horrifying, hard reset for humanity. It proved that sometimes destruction can paradoxically lead to creation. And it forces us to ask a really tough question about our own time. If we were faced with some kind of world-ending crisis, what new ideas, what new structures, what kind of renaissance would we have the courage to build from the ruins?